Hi, I'm Jim with Pour the Juice, and for today's video, I want to talk about rye whiskey. Rye whiskey may not be the most popular whiskey out there. Bourbon up there is probably number one. Scotch is right up there as well. Even Irish whiskey might be a little bit higher than rye whiskey, globally at least. But I think rye is underappreciated. I think rye has been growing, and for me, at least, it's become one of my favorite drinks, my favorite whiskeys to drink. Um, I feel like every rye that I have is completely different from the last rye that I tried. And you can't say that about every whiskey out there. There's a lot of scotch that tastes pretty similar. If you go through Highland scotches, they're all, not all, many of them are pretty close. If you stay in the Glen family, they're fairly similar. Um, Even bourbons. There's a lot of bourbon that's pretty similar out there. But ryes, you don't get that as much. And for me, at least, I know rye was a little intimidating prior to getting into it. You always hear that rye, or I always heard at least, that rye was a little bit harsher, wasn't as sweet as bourbon. Um, it was more simplistic. These are all really kind of wild to me now, having tried a ton of different rye whiskeys and owning a bunch of rye whiskeys, because those aren't really that true. Um, if I was going to give truth to any of them, it would be harshness, specifically because rye does have a almost like a sparkler effect on your tongue at some points. But I wouldn't say it's harsh. And there's some rye whiskeys out there that are super sweet, and the versatility of rye whiskey um, is probably greater than any other whiskeys. Maybe not Scotch, but um, I digress. As a young whiskey aficionado, I really wanted to expand my palate and get into rye, and I wasn't quite sure how to do it. I had tried a few when I was young, couldn't really tell the difference between a rye and a regular bourbon, regular whiskey, whatever you want to call it. And so when somebody asked me what rye tastes like, I couldn't really tell them. It wasn't until much later that I figured out that, maybe you should compare whiskeys against each other, compare a rye whiskey versus a bourbon directly next to each other to get the flavor profiles out a bit more. Um, and so that's what I'm here to kind of like tell you today. This video is going to be about the perfect beginner's rye whiskey, and I'm going to get to that. Um, but I also want to give some examples that I think would be good for beginners. So if you're here watching this video and you want to get into rye, my advice to you would be to compare whatever rye you're going to buy versus its counterpart in the same distillery. So I think a good opportunity to do that would be something with, say, Old Forester. Old Forester rye and Old Forester, I think Old Forester makes an 80 proof or so rye. Maybe not. Maybe it's just a 100 proof rye. Whatever that proof is, get the counterpart for the bourbon with Old Forester and compare them against each other. And you'll be able to pick out those rye notes fairly easily when you do. I think that would be a solid way to go about it. Elijah Craig has a lower proof rye. And of course, they have their lower proof bourbons. Woodford Reserve has a ton of different types of whiskey in their base category. They have the bourbon, they have the rye, they have a single malt. I believe they have a wheated as well. And so those are good opportunities to try each of those whiskeys next to each other and really get those notes out. And I think that that's important if you're just starting this journey into whiskey or into rye, to see if you do enjoy those rye notes and to try to piece them out from the rest of the whiskey notes that you may get along the way. That's what I would have done if I could give myself advice today going back in my whiskey journey. But I would also say that what's important to somebody who's just beginning with rye is getting something that's very approachable. So I wouldn't want to recommend a rye that's going to punch you in the face, that's going to be super minty or super grassy, because you may not like that. You may not like earthy tones. You may just want to be looking for something sweet. Um, and some ryes can get a little earthy. And so there's one that really comes to mind when I'm talking about this. And it's the rye whiskey that I'm going to recommend to every beginner out there. And that is Sazerac Rye. Sazerac Rye is made by Sazerac. It's the Buffalo Trace family. And coming out of Buffalo Trace, it is, I would say, pretty much just as sweet as something like a Buffalo Trace. It has a lot of the same notes uh, coming out of that distillery. You'll get fruit in this Sazerac rye whiskey, and it's delightful. It's really nice whiskey. It's very palatable for somebody beginning their rye journey. But what I would also say is, if you're going to go out and you're going to buy this, and I suggest you do buy it, it's cheap. It's $26, $27, $25 MSRP, I believe. If you're going to buy this, I highly recommend pairing it with a normal Buffalo Trace. Take a small glass of each and sip them next to each other. And I promise you, even though this may seem on its own just like a sweet Buffalo Trace product, if you compare it next to a normal Buffalo Trace or a Blanton's, whatever you want to do, um, benchmark, top floor, whatever, anything out of that Buffalo Trace line, Sazerac line, compare this to that, and you will be able to pick out those rye notes, and then you can start moving on. But this is where I would start. Um, Try it out and let me know, specifically in the comments. If you got this far and you enjoyed the video and you want to try that out, let me know what you think about my choice as the best beginner rye whiskey. Um, I think it's the best one for beginners, but let me know. Also, please subscribe. Greatly appreciated. Yeah. Cheers.